What's the difference between white sugar and brown sugar? And what's up with the really exotic, strange type of sugars that are unrefined and organic? And how exactly does cooking with any of these sugars make a difference? Well, in order to understand the pros and cons of each sugar, we have to go back a little bit, back to how sugar is made and where it actually comes from. You see, sugar, the way we know it, that fine ground up crystallized powder that you get at your local supermarket, hasn't always been like that. But the closest thing that we have to that predates all the way back to 350 AD, invented by the people that now live today on the Indian subcontinent. Sugars were made by processing large amounts of sugarcane, by extracting the juices from it and then boiling them down. Once boiled down, it'll have a super thick consistency, which we like to call molasses. But that's not exactly the molasses that we know today. That's just super unrefined, boiled down sugarcane juice. But what we know today as pure white sugar only came around during the Industrial Revolution, roughly the 1800s. You see, like with a lot of common household items and products, during the Industrial Revolution is where everything started to get mass-produced and mechanized. This includes our good old friend, sugar. Now, how modern sugar is made is by taking the sugarcane juice and mixing it with a little bit of water, heating it up, and then passing it through a centrifuge, a device that spins really quickly, and that mechanism spits different liquids apart. In this case, the centrifuge will separate the sugars from the molasses. The sugars are separated to one container and the molasses separated to the other. The molasses is then boiled down until it's like a nice thick paste, then it's sold off. As for the sugars, more water is added and it's passed through the centrifuge a few more times until more of the impurities are separated out. What we're left with is raw, unrefined cane sugar. You've probably seen this in the health section where they put an unreasonable marked up price on this sugar, touting it as healthier and organic, where it's pretty much just gone through the first process of refinement. And they took it out and they packaged it and they sold it to you for 4 times the price of normal sugar. Yikes, the business of health foods are something else. So, going further as to how white sugar is made, the next step, it goes through a process of carbonation, where CO2 and calcium hydroxide is added to the mixture. This acts as a binder for the further impurities as well as the majority of the color. It binds to anything that's inorganic and kind of lets it float to the top, and the remaining sugars kind of stay at the bottom. That is separated and on to the last step, where the sugar is passed through a few more filters and eventually evaporated, and that is where we have our classic white sugar. But what about regular brown sugar? Where does that come in? So you've probably been told at some point in your life that brown sugar is a little bit healthier than white sugar because it's gone through less processing. Unfortunately, that's kind of the opposite. It's gone through actually an additional step of processing. The unrefined brown sugar, that's gone through less processing. But it's also completely different from brown sugar. It's thicker, it's wetter, it's mushier. Let's just say the majority of people don't usually buy it, and unless you seek it out for yourself, you've probably never even used it. So, brown sugar is made by adding molasses that we've extracted in the previous steps to the white sugar itself. Once it's mixed, just a little bit though, not too much, it'll give it that nice brown hue that we like and a little bit of that molasses flavor. So technically all brown sugar is white sugar coated with a bit of molasses that was removed from it in the previous rounds, and I'll add it back in. So now that we know where sugar came from and how it's made, what exactly is the difference between using just regular white sugar, brown sugar, and unrefined cane sugar? The key here is in the molasses. You see, molasses itself contains quite a bit of water, and that water can either further add hydration to your baked goods or weigh it down in other aspects like making a meringue. You want the meringue nice and fluffy, and the last thing you're looking for is collapsed meringue. As for cookies, you want something that's a little bit moister, a little bit more denser. That's where brown sugar or unrefined cane sugar would be a little bit more use than white sugar. Now, does it actually make a huge difference? I did some tests and let's find out. For the experiment, I'll be testing 3 different types of sugars: white sugar, brown sugar, and unrefined cane sugar. Using the 3 sugars, we'll be making a meringue to see how the airiness and the flavor is impacted by the different types of sugars. The second thing we're baking is a scone or scone, depending on what, I guess, social hierarchy you're on. I'm not even sure which one's the fancier one, which one's the not so fancy one. Either way, the main claim is that molasses retains more water. So things baked with sugar that has a little bit more molasses or a lot more molasses will be more moister, but a lot more denser. And things baked with just white sugar will be a lot lighter, crisper, and not as dense, aka a little bit fluffier. For the meringues, I'll be cracking 3 eggs, separating the yolks from the whites, and I'll be using the same portion for all 3 sugars. Here, I'm pouring it into a mixing bowl and whisking it on high with my electric mixer. I'll keep going until it gets nice and frothy, and then I'll add in my sugar. First up is the white sugar. I add in a little bit gradually, but in all honesty, adding it in a slow, gradual process doesn't really make a big difference in terms of how airy the meringue is. I find it to be roughly all the same. You just keep eating it until it gets nice and airy. That's pretty much it. Once it has nice stiff peaks, we'll be transfer it to a bowl, and here I'll be repeating the same process for the brown sugar and unrefined sugar. Now straight off the bat, as we can see, the main difference visually from all 3 sugars is the color. With the brown and white one being roughly similar, the brown sugar has a slight tinge of light caramel color to it, but to be honest, if there wasn't a comparison right next to it, you couldn't really tell the difference. Only with the white sugar meringue right next to the brown sugar meringue can you really tell, like, oh shit, there's a little bit of a color difference. But the unrefined sugar one, that one, there's a clear difference. That one is much darker in color, and you can immediately tell there's something different with that one. The interesting thing I found about the taste of all 3 is that the white sugar definitely tastes way sweeter, despite all 3 meringues having the same amount of sugar. My hypothesis as to why this is happening is most likely because the molasses itself has a slightly toastier and nuttier flavor to it, also a little bit of a bittery undertone. So that in turn balances out the sweetness, making it not as intense. The white sugar on the other hand doesn't have that, so it's just coming at you full blast, hitting you with the maximum amount of sweetness. In terms of airiness, funny enough, the airiest meringue was actually the brown sugar meringue, with the white sugar meringue being the second fluffiest and the unrefined sugar meringue being the least fluffiest. That being said though, they're all extremely close. Like, you can barely tell the difference close. The only time you can actually taste the difference is by eating it in succession and then actually having it side by side to make the direct comparison. But if you're not doing that, there's barely a difference. So for meringues, use whatever sugar you like. It doesn't really matter in terms of flavor and sweetness. There is a difference. Use white sugar of the exact same amount if you want a sweeter note. Use unrefined brown sugar if you don't want it as sweet, but you still need that exact measurement for sugar. And use brown sugar for a nice happy medium. Now then, onto the scones. Now, like with the meringue, I'm doing the same thing with the scones, keeping all ingredient measurements exactly the same, the only difference being the different sugars between each batter. Now, the funny thing about scones are that their measurements and ingredient lists are extremely similar to cookies. The main differences, however, are only in the ratios, not the ingredients. Funny how just tweaking the ratios a little bit, you go from a scone to the classic cookie. Now for the end results of the scones, there's a clear color difference between all 3. As usual, the brown sugar being very close visually with the white sugar, and only obvious when they're put side by side that you can really tell the difference. As for the unrefined brown sugar one, that's very obvious. That is clearly different. Now in terms of texture, it's quite interesting. The white sugar scones were much drier compared to the brown sugar and the unrefined sugar. It was indeed a little bit lighter and also slightly crispy at the bottom. For the brown sugar one though, it was a little bit moister, but funny enough, also very airy. As for the unrefined brown sugar one, that one was a lot denser as predicted and a lot more moister. That was my personal favorite one because it had that more crumbly texture to it, as well as a little bit more hydration, less dry, but at the same time still crumbly. All in all, these were made with all the other ingredients controlled and exactly the same, the only difference being the different types of sugars. Does that mean all your baked goods will automatically become dry, airy, and slightly crispy with white sugar and automatically moist and dense when you use unrefined brown sugar? Not exactly. You can still play around with the other variables. Butter, water, the different flours, even leveling agents like baking soda, baking powder, to kind of customize and get your recipe just right. But of course, this is where you can tweak existing recipes to suit your own. If you know that this recipe that you're using is almost perfect, but not quite right, now you know maybe you can make some adjustments with the sugar to get the exact texture that you want. Want a little bit more lighter consistency to it? Replace it with white sugar. Want a little bit more density to it? A little bit more moisture? Add a bit brown sugar. Maybe unrefined brown sugar if you want it really moist. And that is it for my findings regarding these 3 sugars: white sugar, brown sugar, and unrefined sugar. Hope you can take this information and make cooking a little bit easier and a little bit more funner in your day-to-day living. See ya.